When we had returned to the corridor below the battlements, after our search for the man who had lowered himself down to the window of the hall, Nikola brought with him the soft felt hat I had observed upon the head of that villainous Chinaman Quong Ma that morning. Though neither of us was altogether surprised at finding that he was the man we suspected of being in the castle, we were none the more pleased at having our suspicions confirmed. The thing which puzzled us most, however, was how he had obtained admission, seeing that he had not been in sight when I had entered the castle that morning, that I had informed Nikola of my meeting with him within 5 minutes of my arrival, and that the drawbridge had been raised, if not at once, certainly within a quarter of an hour of making my report. And yet it was plain that he had been upon the battlements, that he was in the castle, and that his being there boded no good was as apparent as his presence. "I always knew they had original ideas," said Nikola, "but I had no idea that they were as clever as this. We shall have to be very careful what we do for the future, for, from what I know of them, they would stick at nothing. To-morrow morning we must search the castle from dungeon to turret, and if we find them—" "In that case," said Nikola, "I fancy I know a way of dealing with them. Dona Consuelo locks her door at night, I suppose?" I informed him that I had advised her to do so. "It would be better that we should make certain," he answered, and proceeding to the door in question, he softly turned the handle. It was securely fastened from the inside. "Seems all right," said Nikola. "Now we will return to our own quarters and make everything secure there." We did as suggested, and when everything was made fast, to securely lock the door in the corridor behind us. Reaching the hall once more, we made a careful survey of the various rooms, including not only the apartments leading out of it, but also the passage leading to Ah Win's quarters. No sign, however, of the man we wanted was to be seen there. Returning to the hall, we assured ourselves that our patient was still sleeping quietly, and then I bade Nikola good night and prepared to go to my room. "I should advise you to lock your door," he said as we parted. "You cannot take too many precautions when Quong Ma and his companion are about. Should I require your assistance during the night, I will ring for you." I promised to answer his call immediately, and was about to turn away, when it occurred to me to ask him a question to which he had promised me an answer upwards of a month before. "On the night that we left Newcastle," I said, "you were kind enough to say that when a fitting opportunity occurred to you, you would tell me what has induced these men to follow you as they are doing." "There is no reason why you should not hear it," Nikola replied. "To tell it in full, however, would be too long a story, but I will briefly summarize it for you. In order to obtain the information necessary for carrying out the experiment upon which we are now engaged, I penetrated, as I think I have already informed you, into a certain monastery situated in the least known portion of Thibet. My companion and I carried our lives in our hands, if ever men have done so in the history of the world. The better to carry out my scheme, I might explain, I impersonated a high official who had lately been elected one of the rulers of the order. At a most unfortunate moment the fraud was discovered, and my companion and I were ordered to be hurled from the roof of the monastery into the precipice below. We managed to escape, however, but not before I had secured the precious secret for which I had risked so much. The monks traced us on our journey back to civilization, and 2 of the order, who have had special experience in this sort of work, were detailed to follow us in the hope that they might not only regain possession of a book which contained the secret, but at the same time revenge the insult which had been offered to them. "And you still have the book? Would you care to see it?" asked Nikola. I replied that I should like to immensely, whereupon he retired to his own apartment, to presently return, bringing with him a small packet which he placed upon the table. Untying the string which bound it, and removing a sheet of thin leather, he exposed to my gaze a small book, possibly 8 inches long by 4 wide. The materials in which it was bound were almost dropping apart with age. The backs and corners, however, were clamped with rusty iron. The interior was filled with writing in the Sanskrit character, a great deal of which had faded and was barely decipherable. I took it tenderly in my hands. "And it is to regain possession of this book that these men are following you?" I asked. "To do that," he answered, "and to punish me for the trick I played on them. They have not, however, accomplished their task yet, nor shall they do so if I can help it. Let me once get hold of Quong Ma, and he'll do no more mischief for some time to come." As Nikola said this, his great cat, which for the past few moments had been sitting upon his knees, suddenly stood up and placed its forepaws upon the table, scratched at the cloth. Nikola was watching my face, and what he saw there must have considerably amused him. "You are thinking that Apollyon and I are not unlike. When we get out our claws we are dangerous. It would be well for our Chinese friend if he understood as much. Now you had better be off to bed, and I to my watch." When Nikola relieved me at 8 o'clock the morning following, it was plain that there was something important toward. "Get your breakfast as soon as you can," he said, "and when you have done we will search the castle. You heard nothing suspicious during your watch, I suppose?" "Nothing," I replied. "Everything has gone just as usual." As soon as I had finished my breakfast, Ah Win summoned me, and together we set off on our errand. Beginning with the battlements, we took the castle corridor by corridor, floor by floor, examining every corner and staircase in which it could be possible for a human being to hide himself. Having exhausted the inhabited portion of the building, we searched the rooms into which no one had penetrated from year's end to year's end. These we also drew blank. Then, descending another flight of stairs, we reached the basement, explored the great kitchens, once so busy, and now tenanted only by rats and beetles, and examined the various domestic offices, including the buttery and armoury, still without success. If Quong Ma was in the castle, it looked as if he must certainly possess the power of rendering himself invisible at will. At last we reached the keep, where the old couple, who, as Nikola had said, officiated as caretakers during his absence, had their quarters. At the moment of our arrival, the woman was bitterly upbraiding her husband for some misdeed. "I'll tell 'ee," she said, slapping the table with her hand to emphasise her words, "that when I went to bed last night, they vitals was in yonder cupboard. What I want 'ee to say is where they be now. Don't 'ee say 'ee never saw them, or that it was the cat as stole them, for 'ee may talk till 'ee be black in the face, and I'll not believe 'ee. Cats don't turn handles and undo latches, and mutton don't walk out of the front door on its own leg. If he be a man, he'll tell the truth, and shame the devil." I must leave you to picture for yourself the vehemence with which all of this was said. The words poured from her throat in a torrent, and every sentence was punctuated with slaps upon the table. So engaged were they in their quarrel that some moments elapsed before they perceived Nikola and myself standing in the doorway. When they did, the tumult ceased as if by magic. "You seem to be enjoying yourselves," said Nikola dryly. "Perhaps you'll be kind enough to tell me what it's all about." He had no sooner finished than the irate lady recommenced. "It's just this way, my lord," she said, though why she should have bestowed a title upon Nikola I could not understand. "Last night I was troubled with rheumatism mortal bad. Went to bed early. The old man there, begging your pardon for the liberty I'm taking, was a sitting by the fire, smoking his pipe. Such as being his custom of an evening, he'd had his supper, as I seed with my own eyes. When he'd finished, there was an end leg of mutton in yon cupboard. When it comes this morning, I take it out for breakfast. It's gone, and with it the bread as I baked with my own hands but yesterday. And he stands there saving your presence, my lord, and wants for I to believe how he's not touched it, and the latch of the cupboard down, as you can see for yourselves, honourable gentlemen both, with your own eyes. I've been married these 43 years, and I don't know as how you'll believe it, my lord." Seeing that she was getting up steam once more, Nikola held his hand up to her to be silent. "What you tell me is very interesting," he said, fixing his dark eyes upon her. "But let me understand you properly. You say you went to bed, leaving your husband smoking his pipe in this room. Before retiring, you convinced yourself that the food which is now not forthcoming was in the cupboard. Is that so?" "Yes, my lord and honourable gentlemen, both." And addressing her husband, Nikola continued, "I suppose you went to sleep over your pipe?" The question had to be repeated, and his wife had to admonish him with, "Speak up to his lordship like a man," before he could answer. Even then his reply was scarcely satisfactory. He thought he might have fallen asleep, but he was not at all sure upon the point. He admitted that he was in the habit of doing so, and as far as Nikola was concerned, this settled the matter. "Quong Ma," he said, turning to me, "now I understand where he gets his food from." Then turning to the woman, he said, "Your husband is a heavy sleeper, I suppose?" "Why, bless you, sir," she replied, "he sleeps that heavy you can't wake him. As for snoring, why, the rattling of that old bridge out yonder when they're a drawing of it up ain't to be compared with him, as the saying is. I did hear of a man that lived down Sunderland as did snore so that when he woke up, the folks next door sent in to ask him to go on again, the stillness being that lonesome they couldn't bear it." Nikola peremptorily made the old woman to be silent, and ordered her for the future to see that her door was locked at dusk every evening. And addressing her husband, he inquired if the latter was conversant with the subterranean passages of the castle, and when he had replied in the affirmative, bade him light a lantern and show us all he could. The man did so, and having conducted us across the courtyard, entered a long, low chamber which might once have been used as a bakehouse. In this was a large wooden door secured with many bolts, but now fallen into considerable disrepair. These bolts he drew one by one with an air of importance that was indescribably comic. "I don't quite understand how these bolts come to be fastened if the man is down below," said Nikola, addressing me. I shook my head, whereupon he bade the old man inform him whether there were any other entrances to the vaults in question. "Lor, sir," the man replied, "the castle be fair mazed with them. If you likes the place, I can take you to most any room in the place from down below." "I should have thought of that," said Nikola, more to himself than to me. "I'm sorry I didn't question our friend here before. Quong Ma had evidently mastered the situation, and is playing a game of hide and seek. However, we'll examine the dungeons first, and the passages afterwards. So lead the way, my friend." The old man going ahead carrying the lantern, Nikola following, and Ah Win and myself bringing up the rear, we made our way down the clammy stone staircase into the subterranean portion of the castle. It was an experience that would have been worth anything to a novelist seeking colour for a historical tale. But knowing what I did about the man we were after, I cannot say that I appreciated the incident so much. In addition to my nervousness, my head was aching, while hot and cold perspirations alternately contributed to my general discomfort. What was the matter with me? I could not think. As it was, I was the only member of the party, I believe, who felt any symptoms of fright. The old man with the lantern knew nothing of his danger. Ah Win was an Asiatic and a fatalist, and in his master's presence appeared not to care whom or what he faced, while as for Nikola himself, I believe most implicitly that cold-blooded individual would have faced certain death as coolly and as contentedly as he would have tossed off a glass of wine. Lower and lower we descended, glancing into dungeons which no light of day had ever penetrated, and stooping to make our way along passages in which the moisture from the roof fell, drip, 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 upon our heads. Search as we would, however, we could discover no trace of that villainous Celestial. "We be close down along the sea now, your lordship," said the old man, "and when I tells 'ee that it's summat not many folks as bided in this here castle ever knowed." "Most admirable of men," said Nikola. "You're telling me exactly what I want to know. Do you mean that it's possible for us to reach the sea from where we are now standing without crossing the drawbridge?" "That's exactly what I do mean, my lord," he answered. "And if your lordship and the honourable gentleman will come with I'll let you see for yourselves." Forthwith the old fellow, holding his lantern aloft, turned down a narrow passage leading to the right, and a few minutes later brought us up some steps, at the bottom of which the light of day could be plainly seen. To reach the bottom of the steps was the work of a moment, and once there a curious scene was revealed to us. A doorway opened into the chasm which I have described earlier, and was situated almost directly beneath the drawbridge and the keep. Kneeling down, Nikola and I looked over the edge and could plainly see a number of iron steps let into the rock, one above the other. At the bottom, for it was now a full tide, the sea washed and dashed with terrific force. Rising to his feet again, Nikola addressed the old man. "Is it possible at low tide," he said, "to reach the sands from here?" "Lord bless you, sir," the man replied, "when the tide is down he can get along from rock to rock without as much as wetting shoe leather." "That accounts for everything," said Nikola with considerable satisfaction. "I understand exactly how Quong Ma got into the castle now. He must have laughed to himself when he saw that we had raised the drawbridge in the hope of keeping him out. However, forewarned is forearmed, and this place shall be bricked up this morning. You, my old friend, had better see to it, and be sure that you make a good job of it." The old man promised to do so, and seeing that there was nothing further to be gained by remaining where we were, Nikola bade him conduct us back again to our own portion of the building by a secret passage, if possible. The man assured us that we could do so, and was as good as his word. We climbed, crawled, and scrambled away up the narrow steps along a rabbit warren of a small passage behind our guide. At last he stopped. "Would your lordship be kind enough to say where he think ye are now?" he said. "I have not the least notion," said Nikola. "Nor I," I added. "Well, sir, I will show 'ee." And the man, after a little hunting, he found and pressed something on the wall. There was a grating noise, as the sound of rusty hinges being slowly unfolded. Then a portion of the wall swung outward, and we found ourselves standing at the top of the great staircase, within a few yards of Consuelo's apartments. "This is uncanny, to say the least of it," remarked Nikola. "Pray, do any of these interesting passages open up into the young lady's room opposite, or into the smaller hall occupied by this gentleman and myself?" "Not now, my lord," the man replied. "Time was when they did, but the old lord didn't take kindly to 'em, and they was bricked up as much as 5 year ago." "I'm glad to hear it," said Nikola, and I imagine that I echoed the sentiment. Nikola thereupon thanked the old man and dismissed him, at the same time reiterating his order that the opening in the chasm below the drawbridge should be made secure. The excitement of the search for Quong Ma and the damp of the passages had been too much for me, and by the time we reached the hall I could scarcely stand. "Good heavens, Ingleby," said Nikola as I dropped into a chair, "you're looking awfully ill. What's the matter?" "Can't exactly say," I answered. "I fear I must have caught a chill on the battlements last night." "And yet you accompanied me down those damp passages this morning. Was that wise?" "I was not going to let you go alone," I replied. He glanced sharply at me, as if he would read my thoughts. "Well, well, I'll tell you what you must do. You must be off to bed at once. There can be no doubt about that." I tried to protest. I explained my desire to see the end of the experiment, but Nikola was adamant. To bed I must go, willy-nilly, and to bed I accordingly went, but not in my own room off the hall. The apartment further down the corridor, next door to that occupied by Consuelo, was arranged for me, and when I was safely between the blankets, Nikola prescribed for me, and my sweetheart was duly installed as nurse. My indisposition must have been more severe than I had supposed, for before nightfall I was in a high state of fever, and by midnight was delirious. I remember nothing further until I opened my eyes and found Consuelo sitting by my side. "What does this mean?" I inquired, surprised to find her there. "It means that you have been very ill," she answered, "and that I am your nurse, and I am not going to permit you to talk very much." To do this was a feat of which I was incapable, but I was not going to be silent until I had learnt something of what had happened. "How long have I been ill?" I inquired. "More than a week," she answered, and then added, "You naughty boy, you little know what a fright you have given me. But you must not talk any more, or Dr. Nikola will be angry." She poured out some medicine for me, bade me drink it, and then reseated herself beside me. In 5 minutes I was wrapped in a heavy slumber, from which I did not wake for several hours. When I did, I found Dr. Nikola installed as nurse. Consuelo had disappeared. "Well, Ingleby," said Nikola cheerily, as he felt my pulse, "you have had a sharp bout of it, but I'm glad to see we've managed to pull you through. How do you feel in yourself?" "Much better," I answered, "though still a bit shaky." "I don't wonder at it," he said. "Do you feel hungry?" "I feel as if I could eat anything," I answered. "Well, that's a good sign. I'll see that something is sent to you. In the meanwhile, keep as quiet as possible. When I leave you, I'll send your sweetheart to you. She's been a devoted nurse, and between ourselves, I rather fancy you owe your life to her." "God bless her," I answered fervently. "But you call her my sweetheart. What do you mean by that?" "My dear fellow, I know everything. One night the young lady in question was rather concerned about you, and in her agitation she allowed the cat to slip out of the bag. You young people seem to have managed the matter pretty well in the short time you've known each other. Now keep quiet for a few moments while I see if I can find her." He was making for the door when I stopped him. "You have not told me how the Don is," I said. "How does the experiment progress?" His face clouded over. "It has proved successful," he answered, but with a sudden sternness that surprised me. It was for all the world as if he were trying to convince me what he said was correct, although in his own heart he knew it was not so. When he spoke again it was very slowly. "Yes, Ingleby," he said, as if he were weighing every word before he uttered it. "The experiment has proved a success. I have made the Don a young man, but, well, to tell the truth, I have made a mistake in my calculations, a mistake that I cannot explain, and that I can in no way account for." "And the result?" "Don't ask me," he said, "for I am afraid I do not know myself. By the time you are on your feet again I shall hope to have come nearer an understanding of the situation. Then I shall be able to tell you more of what I hope and fear. At present I scarcely like to think of it myself." To my surprise, as I watched him, I saw great beads of perspiration start out upon his forehead, and for the first time since I had known him I saw a look of terror in Dr. Nikola's face. I tried to question him further upon the subject, but he bade me wait until I was stronger, and presently repeating that he would find Consuelo, he left me. When my sweetheart entered the room, looking more beautiful than I had ever seen her, I forgot for the time being about Nikola. "You are looking much better," she said, as she came toward me and put down upon the table the tray she carried in her hand. "Here is some beef tea which I have made for you myself. If you don't drink it all up, I shall let the old woman in the kitchen make it for you in the future, and bring it to you herself." "You'd better not," I answered. "In that case I should refuse to touch a drop of it, and should die of slow starvation in consequence." With a gentleness that was infinitely becoming to her, she lifted my head and held the cup while I drank. If I took longer over it than I should have done at any other time, the fact must of course be attributed to my weakness. "Dr. Nikola says he is very pleased with the progress you have made," she said, when she had replaced the cup upon the table. "But you are to be kept very quiet for some days, and to sleep as much as possible." "And when am I to get up?" I asked. "Get up!" she cried in mock horror. "You must not even think of such a thing for a week at least." "A week!" I replied. "Do you think I have to stay here for a week?" "So Dr. Nikola says." The remainder of our conversation is too sacred to be set down in cold drawn type. Let it suffice that when I fell asleep again it was with her hand in mine. I was more in love even than I had been before. As Consuelo had predicted, more than a week had elapsed before I was permitted to leave my room. Even then I was not allowed to return to my duties at once, but spent the greater portion of my time with Consuelo on the battlements, gaining strength with every breath of sea air that I inhaled. Nikola I saw but little of. He examined me every morning, and on one or two occasions honoured us with his company for a brief period on the castle roof. At the best of times, however, he was not a good companion. He was invariably absorbed in his own thoughts, spoke but a little, and struck me as being very anxious to say good-bye almost as soon as he arrived. Since then I have learned the true reason of it all, and I have been able to see that complex character in a new light. It never struck me how lonely the man's life must be. During the whole time that I was associated with him, I never once heard him speak of kith or kin. Friends he appeared to have none, while his acquaintances numbered only such men as were necessary to the particular work he happened to be engaged in at the moment of their meeting. His very attainments, his peculiar knowledge of the world, of its under and mystic side, were sufficient to make him hold aloof from his fellow men. In all matters of comfort, a rigid ascetic, the good things of life had no temptation for him. To sum it all up, of this I feel certain, so certain that at times it becomes almost a pain that Nikola, with all his sternness, his self-denial, his genius, and his failings, hungered for one thing, and that was to be loved. Why should I say this, considering that the only evidence I have to offer tends to lead one's thoughts in a contrary direction? I do not know, but as I remarked just now, I feel convinced that my hypothesis is a correct one, as I am that I love Consuelo. But to return to my story, it was not until nearly a fortnight had elapsed since my return to consciousness that I was permitted to take up my duties again. When I did, I returned to my old quarters leading out of the hall, and I think Nikola was pleased once more to have my cooperation. At any rate, he led me to suppose that he was. "When you think that you are up to the mark, I shall be pleased to show you the Don," he said, "and to hear your opinion of him." I expressed myself as being quite equal to seeing him at once. "Very good," he answered, "but I warn you to be prepared for a great and somewhat unpleasant change in the man." So saying, he led me across the hall towards the room in which I had before my illness spent so many hours. Inserting the key in the lock, he turned it, and we entered. I had expected to find it exactly as I had last seen it. A surprise, however, was in store for me. The bed placed in the centre was gone, as were both the electrical appliances. The clock and the thermometers had been removed, the only things that still remained being the electric lights which suspended from the ceiling, and the enclosed fixtures for regulating the supply of hot and cold air. In point of fact, it was a bare room, as well as could be imagined. "Don Miguel," said Nikola, "I have brought an old friend to see you." I looked about the room, but for a moment could see nothing of the old man in question. Then my eye lighted upon what looked like a heap of clothes huddled up on the mattress in the corner. On hearing Nikola's voice, the face looked up at me, a face so terrible, so demoniacal, that I might say that I involuntarily shrank from it. What there was about it that caused me such revulsion I cannot say. It was the countenance of a young man, if you can imagine a man endowed with perpetual youth, and with that youth the cunning, the cruelty, and the vice of countless centuries. "Steady, my friend," I heard Nikola say, and as he did so he placed his hand upon my arm. "Remember, Ingleby, this is nothing more than an experiment." Then, addressing the crouching figure, he bade him stand up. With a snarl like that of a dog, or rather a wild beast, who is compelled to do a thing very much against his will, the man obeyed. I was able then to take better stock of him. Accustomed as I was to the old Don's face, I found it difficult to realize that the healthy, vigorous man standing before me was he, and yet I had only to look at him carefully to have all the doubt upon the subject removed. He was the same, and yet not the same. At any rate, he was an illustration of the marvellous, nay, the almost unbelievable success of Nikola's experiment. You remember the Don as he was, and you can see to what I have been able to bring him, said Nikola sadly, and for the one moment without a trace of triumph. This, however, was soon forthcoming. Out of an old man tottering on the brink of the grave, I have manufactured a young and vigorous creature, such as you now see before you. I have made him. I have transformed him. I have subjected nature to science. I have revolutionized the world, abolished death, and upset the teachings and essential ideas of all religions. I have proved that old age can be prevented, and that the grave defied. And I have failed. Under the intensity of his emotion his voice broke, and something very like a sob burst from him. Never since had I known Nikola had I seen him as he was then. To all appearances he was well nigh broken-hearted. "If you have done all this," I asked, "how can you say that you have failed?" "Are you so blind that you cannot see?" he answered. "Examine the man for yourself, and you'll find that he is a human being in animal life only. I have given him back his youth, his strength, his enjoyment in living, but I cannot give him back his mind. In his body I have triumphed, in his brain I have completely failed." "But can it not be set right?" I inquired. "Is the case quite hopeless?" "Nothing is hopeless," he answered, "but it will take years, centuries perhaps, at work to find the secret. I thought when I built up the body I should be building up the brain as well. It was not so. In proportion as his body renewed its youth, his brain shrunk. Let me give you an illustration." He went forwards towards the man, who was now once more crouching upon the floor, watching us over his right shoulder, as if he were afraid we were going to do him harm. "Well, Miguel," said Nikola, patting him upon the head, and speaking to him in the same tone he would have used to a favourite monkey, "how is it with you to-day?" The man, however, took no notice, but bending down played with the lace of Nikola's shoe, now and again looking swiftly up into his face as if he dreaded a blow, and as swiftly looking away again. "This should prove to you what I mean," said Nikola, addressing me. "In his present condition he is less than a man, and yet where would you find a finer frame? His heart, his lungs, his constitution are all perfect." While he had been speaking he had turned his back upon the beast upon the floor, and as he uttered the last words he moved towards me. He had not taken a step, however, before the Don was half off his feet. From childish idiocy his expression had changed until it was a fiendish malignity that surpasses all description in words. In another moment he would have thrown himself on Nikola. As it was, he glared at him until he turned, when in an instant the wild expression was gone, and he was crouching upon the floor once more, picking at his fingers and smiling to himself. "You can see for yourself what he is," said Nikola. "An imbecile. But for one ray of hope I should despair of him." "There is, then, a ray of hope?" I said eagerly, clutching him like a drowning man at a straw. He held out. "Thank God for that." "There is a ray," he answered, "but it is a very little one. I'll give you an example." Turning to the wretched creature on the floor, he extended his hands towards him, and gradually lifting it, bade him rise. The effect was instantaneous. The man rose little by little until he stood upright. Once more pointing his hand directly at him, Nikola moved towards him until the points of his fingers were scarcely an inch from the other's eyes, and slowly raising his fingers he made an upward and downward pass. The eyes closed, and the man still remained rigid against the wall. Turning to me, Nikola said, "You can see for yourself that he is absolutely under my influence and control." I approached and made a careful examination. There could be no doubt about his condition. It was one of the hypnotic coma, and on raising one of the eyelids I found the ball turned upwards and wandering in its orbit. "You are satisfied?" inquired Nikola. "Perfectly," I answered. "In that case let us proceed." "To whom am I speaking?" asked Nikola, addressing the man before him. "To Miguel de Moreno," was the answer, given in a perfectly clear and strong voice, and without apparent hesitation. "Do you know where you are?" "I am with Dr. Nikola." "Before you came to me, with whom and where did you live?" "I lived with my great-granddaughter in Cadiz." "Have you any recollection of coming to England?" "I remember it perfectly." "Now lie down upon that mattress and sleep without waking till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." The man did as he was ordered without hesitation. Nikola covered him with the blankets, and as soon as we had made sure of his safety we left the room, carefully locking the door after us. You could have no idea, Ingleby, what a disappointment this has been to me. 3 times before I have tried and failed, but this time I made sure I had success within my grasp. I have progressed further now than I have ever done before, it is true, but it is the brain that has beaten me. As long as I live I will persevere, and the perfect man who shall retain his youth through all ages shall eventually walk the earth. Now, good night." He held out his hand to me. As I shook it, Apollyon came up and rubbed him against my leg, as if to show that he too appreciated my sympathy. It struck me that I had heard nothing of our friend Quong Ma since we had searched the subterranean portion of the castle for him. I asked Nikola if he had anything to tell me concerning him. "Nothing," he answered, "saving that last night I felt certain that I saw a man across the courtyard. It was just before midnight. The moon was about the building, and I am ready to stake anything that I am not deceived." "But who could it have been? That's exactly what I want to know," he answered. "You were safe in bed and asleep. It was not the caretaker, for I tried his door and found it locked, and from the sound that greeted me I had good proof it was not he." "But might it not have been Ah Win?" I asked. "I thought so. Before going in search of the figure I hastened to his room, only to find him asleep." "In that case it must have been Quong Ma. But how does the fellow live, and why does he not strike?" "Because he has not yet found his opportunity. When he does, you may be sure he will avail himself of it. And once more, good night. You need not trouble about our patient. I shall take a look at him about midnight." "Good night," I said, and went to my room, the door of which I carefully locked. My last waking thoughts were of Consuelo, and my speculation as to what her feelings would be when she realized the terrible change that had taken place in her great-grandfather was sufficient to give me a nightmare. Over and over again I was afflicted with the most horrible dreams, and when I was roused by a loud thumping on my door, and Nikola's voice calling for admittance, it seemed so much part and parcel of the horror that my brain had just pictured for me that for a moment I took no notice of it. It sounded again, so springing from my bed I ran to the door and opened it. "What's the matter?" I asked when he was standing before me. His usual pale face was now ghastly in its whiteness. "Good heavens, man!" he cried. "You have no notion what has happened. Dress yourself immediately and come with me." He sat upon my bed while I huddled my clothes on, and then when I was ready he seized me by the wrist and half dragged me, half led me into the hall. Once there, he pointed to the figure of a man stretched out before the door. It was Ah Win, and his throat was cut from ear to ear. The sight was so sudden and so totally unexpected, it was almost too much for me. Recovering my presence of mind, however, I knelt down and examined him. "Look at his hands," said Nikola. "They are cut to the bone with some sharp-bladed instrument. The murderer must have come here in search of me. Ah Win must have met him, tried to prevent him reaching the door, and was unable to warn us, and so have met his fate." We were both too much overcome to continue the discussion. Quong Ma had struck at last. End of chapter 8.